This video lecture will be to cover the section of the notes entitled Parliament Limits the English Monarchy. We looked at absolutism in Spain, we looked at absolutism in France, we looked at absolutism in the rest of Europe, we looked at absolutism in Russia, and now we're going to look at absolutism in English, which is completely different because it's not absolutism at all. All right, to start off with, to give a definition, vocab word number one is parliament. This is something that the English had that was a more effective institution than the ones that existed in other countries that weren't utilized or kind of ignored. So the parliament is the legislative branch of the English government. They're the ones that make the laws, that write the laws, and they're elected representatives. And so unlike other countries, these individuals who were elected by the people had a more active participation in what went on in the nation and what decisions that their leaders made. All right, last time we looked at England, we looked at Elizabeth. She brought the Renaissance to England, but when she passed away, James I became the King of England. Little side note about James I, I bet you can't guess which version of the Bible was agreed upon during his reign. He got a bunch of scholars together and they came up with an English translation of the Bible. Probably never guess what it was called. All right, fine, I'll tell you. It's the King James Version of the Bible. I don't have that written down. I'm just telling you. All right, in 1637, excuse me, before I get there, let's look at a definition of another legal term. This one is habeas corpus, a Latin term. So this is a writ requiring that a person under arrest be brought before a judge or into court, especially to secure the person's release unless lawful grounds are shown for their detention. So it's a really long, fancy way of saying that people in England had rights. They couldn't be thrown in jail for no reason. Whoever was accusing them had to prove that they did something wrong. So this is a term to identify legal rights that in this case English people had in their nation. Very different than what would happen in France or Spain or Austria or Prussia. English people could appreciate the right of law. All right. That leads to an event during the reign of the next king, Charles I. He was forced to sign a document in order for him to become the next king. This document granted English people certain rights, like the habeas corpus law that was passed, and then some other ones as well, similar to rights we would see in the American Constitution and the Bill of Rights. This went on pretty much ignored by Charles I. He said, oh yeah, I'll respect all these rights, but then didn't back up what he had said until the conflict that existed with the Scottish, who were constantly having conflicts with the English because they were trying to share the same island. This conflict led to Charles needing to ask Parliament to increase taxes to pay for this war, which they were not happy to do, which led to more concessions and more written laws that protected English people's rights. Time went on, and Charles I passed away. Charles II became king, and Charles II was unliked. And he didn't listen to the Parliament. He didn't take into account what the people wanted. So the frustration of the English people culminated in a civil war during the reign of Charles I, my mistake, not Charles II. There were two sides to this war. You don't have to know the sides, but just for reference sake, you had the Cavaliers on the one side, and if you can kind of see from the notes there, it's upside down, but they supported the king. The Roundheads supported the Parliament, and these two sides fought with each other, literally. All right. An individual rose up through the leadership to the ranks on the parliamentary Roundhead side, the anti-king side, and this individual's name was Oliver Cromwell. This is a picture of him here. and his leadership helped lead the parliamentary anti-king part of the Civil War to victory. I always like to stop and call attention to an individual who can wear a coat of armor with a collar. I feel like that's something that needs to be acknowledged before moving on. All right, one of the end results of this war is that the king was captured, Charles was captured, and the English people expressed their displeasure with his blatant disregard for their written rights. And what ended up happening to Charles was he was executed. So this is pretty important because it's not often in history a monarch gets put on trial, goes through a system, gets found guilty, and then is executed. Sometimes monarchs are dragged out in the street and executed because they haven't listened to their people and the people rise up and riot against them. But this is an example of the monarch breaking the rules, being put on trial, being found guilty, and then being executed. So this is the way things went in England. The law dictated behavior. The law protected rights. The law was not, no one was above the law. Even the king had to obey the laws. And so this sort of principled, law-based living allowed English people to have a freedom that other countries, people in other countries just didn't have. After Oliver Cromwell died, he served as a sort of a de facto absolutist leader himself while he was in charge of England. But after he died, that led to Charles II being asked to rule England. Interesting story about Charles II. He was actually a relative of Charles I, who was king and who started so much conflict that it led to the Civil War. So they went back to that family after the war was over to ask him to rule. Again, this king was, in order to be given the role of king, had to sign over more documents ensuring the rights of English people would be protected under the law. And after he died, the next king was James II. We've already looked at the contentious relationship that English people have with Catholicism and Protestantism, and he was blatantly Catholic, I guess flamboyantly Catholic, some people might say. And the English people were upset about that. That was like, again, disregarding their wishes, disregarding their religion, and that led to a conflict as well in England. But this time it wasn't a civil war, it was just the development of political parties. And so political parties formed in England. You had those who opposed James II, called themselves the Whigs, and those who supported James II called themselves the Tories. So we see the basis of a two-party system that starts to develop in England. A lot of this should sound familiar. Now, you're going to learn next year in U.S. history that when Andrew Jackson becomes president, some people are going to form a party feeling like he has too much power, and they're going to call themselves the Whigs. So maybe you might remember this when you get to U.S. history next year. All right, eventually, time went on. James died. Sorry, Charles. And not died. What did I think? Charles didn't die. He was asked to abdicate, which he wouldn't do. So they went to his extended family to try to find, Parliament went to his extended family to try to find an appropriate replacement for him. And who they found was William and Mary. I mentioned William before. This is William of Orange. Mary was the daughter. I think I said the wrong king. James II is the king I'm talking about. But Mary was the daughter of James II, and so that made kind of an awkward transition. But the daughter of the King of England married a prince of the Netherlands, which was William of Orange, and the Parliament in England asked them if they would come and take over the king and queen position in England from her father. In doing so, they had to agree to sign the English Bill of Rights, like, we'll make you king, but you got to sign this document ensuring that the rights of English people are written and protected, which they did. It's better to be a king of a country than a prince and princess of a different country. So some of the stipulations in this Bill of Rights were, I will get to it in a second. This is a definition for the term constitutional monarchy, which was set up when William and Mary came to power in England. So this is a form of government in which a non-elected monarch functions as the head of the state within the limits of a constitution, and political power is shared between the monarch and an organized government, such as the British Parliament. So the king is not elected, he's appointed, but there is a written constitutional law that is over every person, including the king. And the king has to work together with the parliament, which is a bunch of elected people whenever he wants to make decisions or pass laws and things like that. So needless to say, this ensures that while there still is a king, this king doesn't have absolute unlimited control like Louis XIV did when ruling over England. It's very, very different than what's going on in all other parts of the world at the same time. So some of the stipulations of the Bill of Rights were no taxes without consent from Parliament, and no suspending of Parliament's laws. In addition to that, they also stated that there would be no interfering with freedom of speech in Parliament. If they wanted to disagree with what the king was doing, they weren't going to be thrown in jail for that or have any other consequences. And the fourth stipulation, no penalty for a citizen who petitions the king about grievances. So you bring your issues to the king, you don't have to be afraid of being thrown in jail. Interesting that English people had all their rights written out and protected by the law. And if you think about it for a second, if you think about where the first people that settled in this country from Europe came from, and they came from England. If they had come from Spain, or if they had come from Austria, or if they had come from Prussia or any other European country, they would have brought with them a history of oppression and governments that were powerful and out of control. And who knows what kind of a government we'd have in this country now. But it just so happens that people who founded the future United States came from a place where they were used to having their rights written out and their leaders respect their rights. And I think that that's something to be thankful for, and it's kind of a unique characteristic in this time period.